This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 139 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Today's topic is culture shock when you come home. So sometimes we hear this referred to as reverse culture shock or re-entry shock. And I've done a couple of episodes on it before because it's something that really affected me, particularly when I came home to Australia after living abroad for about 5 or 6 years. It was so difficult to fit back into the Australian way of life, and I missed so much about the places I'd lived. And I just really struggled for a good couple of years to kind of come to terms with that. And there's still times when I struggle with this. And I think the worst thing about this kind of culture shock is that you're not expecting it often. So when you've travelled to a foreign country, you expect some culture shock. You probably educate yourself about it. You know that things are different there, and you expect to feel, out of your depth sometimes, or, that it'll be difficult or tricky. But when you come back to something familiar to your home country, experiencing culture shock is it's often kind of unexpected. And I think therein lies a lot of the difficulty. But anyway, we'll talk about this whole culture shock when you come home with 3 different guests today. But before we get to them, just a quick reminder that my next Travel Journal School course is starting in the middle of June. It's called Start a Personal Travel Blog. So if you've been curious about blogging as a way to record your journeys or to share your experiences with family and friends back home, then head to traveljournalschool.com. Just sign up there to get some information and you will find out all the details when they're released. So, on to my first guest today, and it's Talon Windwalker. We had a lot in common in this chat because he had also lived away from his home country of the States for about 6 years. And it's a long time to be, and he, like me, he travelled even much more widely than me, hadn't been just in one spot for 6 years. But it's a long time to be away, and you really adjust to a different way of life when you're away for that long, I think. So it was really interesting to hear about his experiences of his culture shock when he returned home.
Yeah, we've been back for just over 2 years. Mm-hmm. And it's been really rough for me. She's done fine. I'm still wrestling with it. It's a big change. I'm still back into the career that I really love, hospice. I actually love working in hospice. Mm. But having that, and I did while we were traveling. I missed having a kitchen that I could really have the things that I want in it, so that I could cook and bake. And so now. I've got that, and we missed having a pet, and so we've got a cat, and it's just not the same for me. Having the opportunity to just say, hey, next weekend, why don't we go to Italy for a couple of days?
Yeah.
Or a lot of times, especially the way that we were traveling, because we didn't have a place to live, we were just living wherever we were in the moment. And we get to a place and it'd be like, so how long are you going to be here? I don't know. Most of the time we planned on being to a place, and, sometimes we thought we were going to stay longer. We got there and we didn't like it. And so we were out of there a lot quicker. And other places, like Budapest, I kind of went there as we're nearby. It's kind of on the way to our next stop. So we'll just go spend a few days there, and then we'll go back to Prague and spend more time there. And we fell in love with Budapest right away and ended up staying 2.5 months.
Oh, wow,
and then
lucky.
We came back later and actually applied for a residency visa because we just thoroughly loved it. Yeah. And, so doing that kind of travel, it's such a different experience of places, and we've been in places that we hadn't seen the touristy spots because, we always tried to get Airbnb or, rent an apartment or something that was with other locals because we really wanted to see, well, what's the culture like? That was really our big draw. What's the culture? What's the food like? What's it like living here? That's what we wanted to see mostly. And so, having those experiences of going to the nearby market and even just some of the kind of weird things that you see in grocery stores and, having that kind of experience is so different than when you're on a, 1 or 2 week holiday.
Yeah.
So I really, I miss having that independence. I miss having that freedom. Like right now we're moving. And so it's such a difference when you're traveling and, okay, well, we're moving to a new city now. It's so much easier, and especially when you only have to worry about your backpack or your suitcase.
Not too much stuff. Yep.
Yeah. And here in the U.S., I don't know what renting is like in Australia, but here it's such a pain. There's this application process, and a lot of these places have this list of 50 requirements they have, and you have to do this, you have to do that. It can take days to hear whether or not you got it, and of course you have to pay for that whole application process. And then, different places want first month's rent plus a deposit. Others want first, last, and a deposit. There's just like all these things. And I thought, so many other countries, we went to see an apartment. We met with the person who's managing or owning it. We looked at it. We liked it. We said yes. We signed the paper. Often you'd even have to do that. You handed them the money. They handed you the keys. You were good.
Simple.
It's just such a different experience. So, trying to figure that out here. And then now, so we finally got a place, but now I have to move furniture.
Yes, furniture. It's so annoying, isn't it?
The couch does not fit in my car.
No, exactly.
Now I've got to organize all that. And it's just those kinds of things. And two, we're traveling every day. We had our days where we didn't really leave the house or do much exploring, but we typically were out every day to some extent, and often took a different street because we were walking most of the time, or we, took public transportation because most countries have good ones, unlike here.
Same.
So we would have all these, just kind of cool little experiences. I was thinking the other day when we were living in this one town in Mexico in winter, it got really, really cold. And of course, homes there don't really have indoor heating like we do here. And so it was pretty chilly while we were out for a walk, and we walked by this bakery, and the bakery had its door from the kitchen open, and the heat was just blasting out. And we just stood there with one of the locals and just enjoyed the heat. And, it was just something so different from our typical life. And that, I think that's the thing I miss the most from travel is that, every day I have this gift of exploration because I didn't really have this set routine that I had to kind of stick with. Every day could be different. And every day I had some even small experience that was new or interesting or fascinating or frustrating, whatever. It was cultural, or it was, we're living here and this is how it is here, or wow, this food blew my mind, whatever. Whereas in your typical daily life, there's so much routine. There's so much, Monday, I need to do this, and that, so I'm really struggling still with that full adjustment.
Oh yeah, I completely understand. I lived abroad for 6 years as well, in fact, and it was spread across Asia and Europe. I was living and working, and it's 12 years ago that I came back, and I remember particularly the first 2 or 3 years were very, very hard. But to this day, I still have not ever really adjusted to having a so-called normal routine kind of life again. And, once my son's finished school, then I think I will be back to having, a slightly more varied, adventurous life, because I really struggle with when things get too routine and stuff. And there's, ways around it, but it's just hard.
Well, it's hard even just kind of sharing and communicating with people. Like, I'll be at work at lunch and, with some coworkers, and we'll be talking about stuff, and they'll say something that will remind me of an experience we had somewhere else. And I'll say, oh yeah, when we were in Morocco, blah, 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 blah. And then I realized after I said it that it probably doesn't sound the way that I meant it. Like, because before when I was traveling and I would meet up with fellow travelers and you said that, they're like, oh, yeah, just like in Cambodia. You know, it was, they realize you're just sharing, no, this was a moment.
Yeah.
Whereas to someone else, it can sound like, oh, well, when I was in Morocco, you know, trying to brag. And
I have a blog post about exactly that. It's exactly that sometimes when you're talking about your travels to other people, that sounds like you're bragging, but it's exactly that. You're just talking about an experience, and you're used to talking about that with other travelers. Yeah, I empathize completely.
And there's so many people here, especially in America, that haven't even left the state they grew up in.
Oh, wow.
They haven't even left the state, much less the country.
Gosh.
And so it's hard for them to relate to me as well, because that life sounds crazy to many people, that you would do that and your child, and you just left and you did all this crazy stuff. And it's just,
to me, it sounds completely normal and a very sensible approach to life. But I know not everyone thinks that.
And I get a lot of people that say, oh my gosh, that sounds just so exciting and stuff. But there's a lot of people that also look at you like, wow, that's crazy. Or they just simply can't relate. Because again, you know, one of my friends, he actually is the manager of a factory, and he had employees who have never left their county.
Wow.
And that blows my mind, because like, I remember when I was working in hospice before we left, I was often in 4 or 5 counties a day. So I can't imagine never leaving your county. That blows my brain. So that's the other side too of trying to adjust to this life, this kind of, you know, quote unquote normal life, is also even just trying to relate to people, because some of the stuff that frustrate them and bother them, I'm just like, are you kidding me? You know, I've seen people with such harder problems and such harder lives, so I can't relate to that, and they can't relate to a lot of my experiences. And so it's just kind of, sometimes it's really fascinating. And a lot of times I hear people talking and I just think inside my head, oh, you really need to get out of this part of the world. You need to see what it's like somewhere else. But you can't really say that either, because it comes off as being really judgmental. And yeah, it kind of is. But you know.
It is, and you can't say it. But yeah, I mean, this is what I always say. One of my big goals for my blog and my podcast is just to encourage everybody to travel to some extent, because it's so life-changing and so, you know, mind-opening. And I think that's, you know, really, really important.
Well, that's the thing. That was one of the big things, you know, I pushed on my blog as well, and I can still continue to do so, is that I want to encourage people to travel, but not even just international, even be a local tourist. Go see a town nearby that you haven't visited. Go to another part of your state you haven't gone to. Go to a state or national park that you haven't hiked. You know, travel doesn't have to be this huge, okay, I'm going for a month to Europe now. You know, it doesn't have to be that. You can do weekend things where you're doing local travel. You can just even explore a different neighborhood. There's all these different ways of getting out. It's just exposing yourself to new things.
Yes,
it's
exactly.
Huge.
Yeah.
New food, new environment, new sights, new smells, whatever. That's all. It just makes such a big difference for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Anytime when you can push the boundary of your comfort zone, it's just so important for your, you know, for your development and for, for just making the most out of life.
Absolutely.
Really, so much of Talon's story is my exact story too. His whole problem with, you know, feeling like he's, you know, destination dropping when he's just having a normal conversation, and people, you know, think that seems like bragging, is something that I really struggled with as well. I'll leave a link in the show notes to the post that I wrote about exactly that. But yeah, anyway, exactly all of the things that Talon experienced, that's exactly how I felt. And I get that he's still struggling to come to terms with some of this. And it's hard because it seems like such a privileged problem to have. It is a very privileged problem to have, but it's still real and it still makes life kind of difficult at times. Now, my next guest today is Luke Mackin. And so he's a third culture kid. He grew up away from his home country, but, with parents who are from the States. So, he feels or felt American in some ways. And so for Luke, it's harder to define what is home. But we had a really interesting conversation about some of the culture shock and reverse culture shock he's experienced throughout his international moves.
I think for me, because I grew up overseas, I've kind of had reverse culture shock in a number of different ways that may be atypical from the average experience, maybe.
But very
so
interesting,
first,
I'm sure.
Yeah. So first moving to the States after 16 years, born and raised in the Philippines, it was not a very easy transition. Just, moving to kind of like a rural part of Pennsylvania, like a university town. So it wasn't that bad, but finding people that kind of like had similar life experiences was pretty impossible.
I bet.
And I remember one time, the first summer we moved back, we were kind of living with my mom's sister. And it was great. It was fun. But, just everything is kind of all over the place, all of our stuff, because we hadn't moved into our new house yet. And I somehow misplaced my yearbook from my old school. I was there kindergarten through ninth grade. And so people had written such nice things, and, it was a real treasure for me. And then it was gone. I couldn't find it. And then it just kind of, I think all the culture shock just kind of hit you right then. That
you
transition.
poor thing.
Yeah, I remember getting so mad, and I punched my brother in the face. I don't know why. It wasn't his fault, but it was just spiraled really badly. And then it just found it. It was in some obvious place. And I think that was my first real experience with kind of a weird kind of reverse culture shock of leaving everything familiar, and having to readapt to everything.
Yeah, that would have been really hard at that age. It's a difficult age to be no matter what, let alone if you're uprooting from and moving to a completely different country.
It was. But eventually, I found my tribe, mostly with international students and people like that. So it all worked out. And I feel in the end, it was really good for me to have that experience, to help me understand my quote unquote home culture a little bit more. And because I think as a TCK, you have it's easy to be judgmental of your home culture. They're so dumb. They don't know anything. I think many countries look at America and with this view of how they are from afar, because
that's true. Yeah, because it's so dominant in culture that everyone has an opinion. Yeah, that's true.
Right. But, when you're there, you kind of understand the one side more. But then also, you see, America's so big. So, anything you've heard about America is true somewhere. But, there's, more progressive or whatever people, population-wise than, whole countries in Europe or Australia, So
that's such a good way to put it. So true.
Yeah. So, I think it gets a bad rap. And a lot of stuff is always hard to understand a little bit, but, it was good for me to have that perspective and be able to kind of bridge both sides a little bit.
Yeah, that is a really interesting perspective. So you spent the first 16 years of your life in the Philippines, and then how long were you in the States for before you left?
12 years. So I finished high school, college, then worked for 5 years, and then moved to Indonesia. So we've been here for 7 years now.
Right. Wow.
Yeah.
That's definitely a way to develop some really interesting and in-depth perspectives about the cultures, I guess.
Yeah. I would find myself kind of, because a lot of my friends, especially in college, were international students. And so they would kind of come in with that, America, stupid, doing whatever stupid thing. And then I feel I would be able to, it's funny because I never would have defended it before, but with them, it's well, you don't really understand this. And I don't know, I think I was able to be a bridge with some stuff. But I was mystified by a lot of stuff too, and continue to be, especially right now. But
yeah, right now it's even more mystifying than usual.
Oh my gosh, yes, it is. But yeah. Anyways,
yes, that's a whole other episode.
That is a whole episode.
What about
and then
now?
one big thing? Yeah, one big thing I remember when I moved to Indonesia, because I grew up in the Philippines, but Indonesia is very similar in a lot of ways. You know, archipelago in Southeast Asia. Dominant religion is obviously different, but a lot of similarities culture wise. And just the way of life is kind of similar. But I remember one thing, moving over like on the airplane and like landing and just being like, I'm really going to miss cheese. Like it like suddenly hit me. I'm like, why am I doing this? Like I need cheese.
of all the different things.
Yeah. I'm like, my family, whatever. Like I need like cheddar cheese.
Did you find that Indonesia managed to provide enough substitutes that you're happy, or obviously you're happy, you're still there, but
yeah, I mean, I think food is always like we love. Well, like whenever we go to Bali which is rarely, or Singapore, just get out of. We live really rurally, really far from any. So anytime we go to a big city, it always feels like a bit of a culture shock, honestly. Just being like, wow, like we can go to this restaurant and get like a burger or
right.
have like some pizza that's not, that's halfway decent.
Yeah.
So we love that. We love being able to do that. Indonesian food's great. But I guess coming from a nation of immigrants, I think we're really spoiled in food choices.
Yeah, and the variety.
So the variety, right? So it's just Monday I can have Thai, Tuesday Mexican, Wednesday Italian, and it's just like huge variety. Whereas here in the kampung, the rural area, the choices are very limited. Like you go to a restaurant, it's just nasi goreng, mie goreng, or padang food, which is all good. But
but sometimes you need a variety.
Yeah, it gets a little tiring for a
I mean, I'm the same because it's the same in Australia that we have so many kinds of food around. Like when I was teaching English and people would ask me, what's typical Australian food, and there's not really an answer at all. But I can say, we might have Thai food or we might have Italian food. We have all, we have a bit of, all the best of the best. And when you're living somewhere where you're mostly having only one kind of cuisine, that would be weird to get used to. And I can understand wanting something different, and cheese.
Yeah, exactly. Cheese. It's high on the list. There's always like things like which country has the best food. And for me, it's always like, it's got to be a nation of immigrants, like New York City or Australia, or, somewhere where you can pick whatever you want. Like Italian food is great, but
not every night.
I love having variety.
Having spent the first, 15 or 16 years of his life in the Philippines and then moving to the US before now being in Indonesia does make the cultural experiences for Luke really mixed, and definitely that kind of reverse culture shock would be happening in lots of situations. So, I think third culture kids would always not quite feel exactly at home in any situation. So there's always a bit of reverse culture shock going on. Now, my final guest today is Jo Duggan. She's a physiotherapist, and Jo worked as a volunteer in Thailand near the Burmese border, like on a medical placement for 6 months. And this was definitely when she, returning from Thailand, experienced reverse culture shock.
I guess the first time I ever travelled solo was to Thailand when I went to work in this medical hospital by myself. And it was such a bizarre place to go to. It's really a middle of nowhere place. It's called Mae Sot, so it's on the border of Burma and Thailand, kind of in between Bangkok and Chiang Mai. If you remember that, you go halfway between them and to just to the side of the country.
Yeah,
and very very small town, marketplace selling all kinds of weird food like turtles to put in turtle soup. Eels and snakes for food, and just like really small country town. And I remember just traveling by myself and having to learn how to do everything. for yourself for the first time, especially the first time you go, even just turning on a shower, trying to figure out the new bathrooms of a place was so bizarre. Yeah, so I found that really hard. I was there for about 6 months, but the thing I actually found the hardest was coming home after all of that, because it was you get used to a small town feel of not having much, of literally just living out of your backpack and not knowing that you don't need everything, I guess.
Yeah, it's true.
Coming home to a big city where you have access to everything so quickly, and I just found it so overwhelming coming back. Like coming back to your big wardrobe of all your clothes and just everything that you realised you could live without. I think that was my biggest defining moment of solo travel.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's kind of like a kind of reverse culture shock, and you've come home and now kind of the wealth is too much now.
Yeah, it was really overwhelming. I guess when I've gone to other places like London and America, it's never that big an issue coming home. There's such similar places. But for 6 months living in the middle of nowhere with people who are so used to kind of huts as their home and no water. Even the hospital had squat toilets. They didn't have nice toilets. And you just get used to all of that stuff. And then, that reverse culture shock. Exactly.
Yeah. It can be really hard, can't it? Like, I think we always expect the culture shock when we go somewhere new to be the hardest part. Yeah. But it's not necessarily the case.
And because you expect it as well.
Yep.
It's overwhelmed. But coming home when you don't expect it, that was weird.
I think one of those real culture shocks when coming home is, especially as Jo described, when you've been somewhere where, where you can survive quite happily with a lot less, and then you come back to the kind of overwhelming opulence of our own society, sort of, certainly coming back to Sydney, Australia is like that, then it's a really difficult thing to kind of understand why you should fit back in, because you feel changed, I think. I know that's how I've felt coming back from certain trips, and you sort of don't want to return to your previous way of living or the old mold. So it's a tricky thing. I mean, this is the thing. Travel changes us in so many ways, and that means sometimes parts of being back home just don't fit anymore. So I guess that's why I find the whole topic of culture shock when you return home to be so fascinating. So I'm grateful for those stories for my guests today. I'll just let you know where you can find them. So you can find Talon at onedad1kid.com, and on Instagram, the same thing, onedad1kid. I'll leave a link to that blog post I wrote about people thinking that talking about your travels is bragging too. You can find Luke at Wild Sumatra. His blog in particular is great and is at wildsumatra.com/blog. And finally, Jo and her husband Jeremy have a website, Coming Home Strong, about their travels, and it's at cominghomestrong.com. Don't forget as well, if you're curious about my Start a Personal Travel blog course, it's coming up. It's a 2-week online course in mid-June, and you can find that at traveljournalschool.com. At the moment, you can just sign up to get information about it. And of course, all of this information is in the show notes for this episode. The show notes are at notaballerina.com/139. And my final request is do come along and join our Facebook group. It's called Thoughtful Travellers. It is full of, as you might guess, thoughtful travellers. I just love the people in that group, and they're from all around the world, all walks of life, and it's so interesting to have our different chats in there about all kinds of travel-related topics. So come along and join us there. And in the meantime, thank you very, very much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.